It seems like every 3 years or so, there's a new wave of people who decide to call into question the efficacy and the necessity of tamping. I know I need to tamp my espresso, that's what everyone does. But there is some understanding to wanting to call into question even the most basic understandings or assumptions. It's important to really understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how doing it in different ways might be beneficial or harmful to your consistency, to your efficiency of your extraction. This video, while it might seem a little boring with the experiments, is actually going to help you improve your daily espresso. There was a great Instagram post by Dr. Samo Smrke where he talks about tamping and the efficacy at different tamp pressures. There's also Quantitative Cafe and the few blog posts he has done with miscellaneous measurements and experiments where he was measuring puck density after multiple tamps, and as well as looking into gas picnometry as a way to measure puck density in maybe a more accurate way. We're also going to take a look quickly at Barista Hustle and what they've done with tamping pressures as well. And then finally, we're going to take a look at an experiment I did recently in order to test my own theory that I've put out in the world, which is double tamping maybe being more consistent. It would seem to me that based off of Michael Cooper's experiments where he shows multiple tamps increases the density, that when you're tamping, if you do a second tamp, it can lessen the amount of inconsistency from puck to puck. Now, before we get into all of this, which will undoubtedly lead you to a therapy session to talk about why your brain is fried because of all the truth bombs I drop on you today, let's talk about BetterHelp, which is the sponsor of today's video. BetterHelp is a company that specializes in making online therapy accessible. By just going onto the app and answering a few questions, you'll get partnered with a therapist just for you. You can do group therapy or single therapy, and you can take notes in the app while you're going through the process. So having something like this that is incredibly flexible with scheduling and is very easy to do, you can use it anywhere you are as long as you have your phone with you, was an incredible benefit in order to start doing something like therapy. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't like talking about. It does have a little bit more exposure today, but it is very important to focus on your mental health, regardless of how you do that. I do think it is something that everyone needs to take into account. This is something that's helped my wife, it's helped a lot of my friends, and I'm confident that it will help you as well. Down below in the caption, I do have a discount code, www.betterhelp.com/Lance Hedrick, which will give you 10% off your first month with a licensed therapist through BetterHelp. So go ahead and check that out because I know a lot of us need something like this, especially in modern times. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring, and let's get on with the video. I was using the Linear Mini R, I was using an EG1 grinder just to make sure I had really nice consistency so that we could see specifically the effects of the tamp on the shot. But volatility was out of this world. It was bang, 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 bang. I was, what's going on? And then all of a sudden on one of my shots, water was coming out of the holes before any coffee was saturated or before you could see the bottom of the basket saturated. Water was just jetting out. So what the heck is going on? So then I pull out the portafilter, I look at the puck, and there is a hole in one side of it that's about 3 millimeters in diameter. A massive hole in that puck. So I checked my tamper, and sure enough, there was a screw that had loosened and fallen out inside here, and it was disallowing me to tamp fully. It was not going all the way when I would push it. And so at that point, the machine was able to pick a place and just exploit it with water once pressure kicked in. I had a similar experience a couple of months back when using the Samo ES1. This has a water debit of 18 milliliters a second. So if you don't have really nice puck prep, or if you're doing something weird like a lighter tamp, not a sufficient tamp, or whatever it might be, this will do the same thing because it fills so quickly, it will find and exploit any issue. And I was having those water jets coming out of my basket here as well. Barista Hustle made a post about this exact thing a few years back where they showed that once you hit 30 pounds of pressure, you're at max density roughly across most coffees, and that's where you should go every time you tamp because there's no way of getting more density once you've hit the max that puck can give you. Now, of course, what it doesn't really talk about is how this changes from coffee to coffee. Some coffees may be at max density at 15 pounds of pressure, some may take more, some may less, whatever it might be, depending on the grinder, depending on the particle distribution, depending on how those particles can sit against each other. But the idea was once you push and it stops pushing, you feel the resistance of the table coming back at you, you've reached the max density for that tamp. They were showing that when you did lesser force, there would be a lot more inconsistency that is kind of introduced into the process. Then we take a look at this data that Samo posted last year. Anything above 6 kilograms per force, you essentially had no real difference in the extraction. Granted, this was using a really dark roasted Colombia coffee, so perhaps there was a lot more resistance in that puck inherently due to the amount of fines produced due to how dark it was roasted. As we know, there's a lot more puck integrity whenever you have a darker and darker roast than you do with lighter roast. It showed at 6 kilogram per that force, you have essentially a similar curve to what you have when you go to 10 and above. Now, the 10 and above all matched identically, but the consistency and everything of that at 6 kilograms was fine and was essentially not really different than what you had with the further weights. But when you had none or you had less than 6, you had a lot more variability that was introduced into the equation. You really see that tamping does matter if you're wanting to get that espresso that is not rife with channeling, which is going to happen without tamping at all. Or like what happened with me, tamping with 2 or 3 kilograms of pressure, that is going to give you a lot of channels. Yes, channeling does exist, but channeling kind of has taken the front seat as the #1 issue in puck preparation or in extraction, when in reality it would be more or less homogeneous extraction or introducing heterogeneity where we don't need any. That is definitely happening, and it's much more evident on lighter roasted coffees or older coffees than it is on darker coffees, which I talk about in this video about the lies that naked portafilters kind of tell us. You do need to tamp it to a good compression. Now, how much compression exactly? That is a great question. Let's imagine that you match in the same size basket the volume of untamped coffee. One of them is really finely ground, one of them is really coarsely ground. Though finely ground, you'd be able to compress to a smaller puck than the coarsely ground. You would barely be able to press it down at all. And that's because of the difference in these particle sizes. Same thing happens with particle size distribution. You're going to get a different compression than if you had loads of fines or loads of boulders or a big mixture of both with low nominal peak. A lot of people just recommend pushing until you're at that full compression. And for the most part, that's what I have been teaching for a long time because that is a difficult variable to really dial in. Could it taste better with lesser tamping, as some of the people years ago talk about with pre-infusion? Potentially, maybe it does taste better, but how accurate will you be in replicating that? Regardless of if you have a spring tamper or not, regardless if you have some sort of magical arm, you're gonna have inconsistencies. And when you're not tamping to full pressure, there is a lot more volatility. Well, what about these norm core spring tamps? Like, it stops me at a certain pressure. Well, with those, it's actually interesting, and Michael Cooper points this out in his blog, which I'll have linked below. Unless you have the perfect volume of coffee in that for the maximum press of the norm core, you will have inconsistent pressure. So if you imagine that you have too much coffee in there, as you press down, there's still more of that spring that can be pressed. So the leveling collar will lift off and you can keep pressing to do more than the amount, or you stop because you think, okay, I've hit the amount that is needed in order to compress this, and you haven't hit the full compression of that spring. So just because you have a 30-pound spring or a 15-pound spring doesn't mean you're getting 15 pounds of pressure or 30 pounds of pressure every time you tamp, unless you have the perfect volume in your basket, which is very difficult to change because we typically go based off of weight, which we should be going based off volume, but that can be a difficult thing to change every day if you like to switch up your coffees often. Speaking of volume, it's actually why Breville includes that little razor tool. The razor tool, against popular belief, is not a distribution tool. It is to check the depth of your coffee bed in your basket. It's easier to dial into volume, not needing a scale. You dial in, go finer and finer or whatever. You increase the amount or decrease the amount of coffee being ground up. And then you use that little razor tool to see if it's touching the top of the coffee puck. The depth of that razor tool hitting the top of the coffee puck is what they think is the perfect volume for that basket for their machine.
Should be good to go. We're going to lock it in and we're going to start our extraction. Now, because there's only a single...
On top of discussing this in Michael Cooper's blog on Quantitative Cafe, he also discusses compression or the density that can change based off of the spring and off of repetitive tamps. So to give you a little insight, I did this double tamp because I read this and I just assumed it would improve my consistency if my first tamp was not at that full pressure. A second one should minimize the difference so that when I go through, I'm able to get a much more consistent product. product. And in his experiment, as you see here, he does 3 different springs. He has a 30-pound spring, the 25-pound spring, and a 15-pound spring on a norm core. And he tamps 10 different times on that same puck. As you can see here, the density increases with each successive tamp. So every tamp you do, you can get more compression or more density. In a past video of mine where I look at the Porcu press, my theory that I was sharing with Shay, who I mentioned in the video, was that the more dense puck is what was allowing for the higher extraction. Like with the recent results of the shaker with densification, it seemed to me that higher density was arguably allowing a more even flow through the puck. Now, something that I did notice is that when I was double tamping, it was taking a bit longer to extract. And so without doing any measurements, I figured, well, it must be extracting more because it's taking longer to make it through the puck, which means that it's probably less heterogeneous extraction. It's more evenly going through the puck, allowing for a more extraction. Not necessarily that more extraction equals good, but meaning that I get more efficiency, which means I could probably go coarser or something along those lines in order to achieve the same extraction with a single tamp. So instead of relying on intuition, and because I've been questioned so many times over the weeks as to why I double tamped, I decided I'd finally just go ahead and test why I double tamped. I used an EG1, I used a Lithium Mini R, and I used the blind shaker in order to distribute. Whenever I was tamping, I used the Decent Tamper, which is not a spring set tamper. It has a spring inside, but it's just to level the collar on the basket. I went full compaction with this, and then for a second tamp, I just did the same thing. I would lift and then go again for full compaction. I dialed in a coffee with a single tamp, and then what I did is I would pull a single tamp shot, and then the next one I would double tamp, then single tamp, then double tamp, then single tamp, then double tamp, so on and so forth until 80 shots had been pulled. I worked with Dr. Jonathan Gagne in order to analyze this, and he created all these graphs for me. But the first thing that you're gonna see is it looks like the single tamping does have a higher extraction. It doesn't turn out to be statistically significant. It's very small, so maybe if we pulled 200 shots or something, maybe that tiny little difference could be significant. But as for now, with 40 shots each, it's very close. It doesn't really seem to be causing that big of a difference, though it might be a little with when you're bootstrapping it, but I'm sure some of you can run that at home. What is interesting is with double tamping, you do get significantly about 0.9 seconds more of extraction, which is really interesting. So it's elongating the extraction, but it's not improving the extraction at all. So it seems that what's really happening with this multiple tamping and the increased density of the puck is maybe not that beneficial to the extraction, if not harmful. Pisses me off a bit, but you live and you learn, and that's why we constantly do this testing, because we have to always be willing to admit faults. Would it do something with a different profile? Maybe. That's the thing that I'm now discovering more than ever. I've always known that there's great volatility between roast profiles, etc. But with this, I can't speak to how much applicability this will have across the board. I'd have to imagine there's less importance the darker the roast is. And so with a light roasted coffee, the fact that there was a difference, it seems to me that there really isn't a need to super optimize the density with tamping. Now, this all being said, what is an interesting point that Jonathan had pointed out to me is that maybe it's an interesting thing to play around with coarser grind sizes that would normally spew through quickly and tamp it a few extra times in order to improve or optimize that density to slow down the flow rate through it. If we are getting more heterogeneous extraction at a constant grind setting with a typical dose of 18 in, 40 out in 28 seconds, which is roughly what I did for this experiment, and then double tamping, well, we're grinding at a pretty grind fine for a traditional style shot. If you grind more coarsely, then maybe that flow rate won't be very uneven. As we saw in the previous video about water dispersion, it seems that turbo shots have really nice edge extraction even on traditional baskets, which is not the case with traditional espresso in traditional baskets. The edges are greatly under extracted, but whenever you coarsen up the grind and allow a faster flow of water through, boom, all of a sudden we get much better edge extraction. So possibly because you're automatically or a priori getting better flow through coarser grounds, maybe you can elongate contact time on turbo shots or something along those lines by just giving a few extra tamps, as it will objectively continually increase the density of that puck. Now, how much will it do is not going to align exactly with the data we looked at from Michael Cooper's experiments, because he was using a finer grind size than something like a turbo shot. So obviously it's not going to scale exactly there. The roast profile, all those are way different. Another thing I was thinking about are these people who are using modern baskets have been forced to grind even finer, and it might increase the perceived bitterness because of how fine you're grinding. Maybe you could go coarser in those baskets, maybe match the grind size of a traditional basket and just tamp 3 or 4 times. Now you might be asking, what if I just hold down the tamp for 10 seconds? Michael Cooper also showed that that is not as effective as tamping and coming back up and tamping again. And he actually showed this using the same pressure springs. So you didn't even need to add an excess amount of pressure on the following tamp. You could just tamp with 15 pounds, tamp with 15 pounds. Quick TLDW for those of you who want to skip and have a little conclusion. It seems that tamping your coffee is definitely necessary in order to have a good repeatable extraction. The amount of force varies widely based off of the coffee. It seems that somewhere around 8 to 12 kilograms of force is going to be more than adequate in order for you to have repeatable espresso. Though of course, if you have just a hand tamp without any spring or anything like that, it's probably best to just go full force until you have the pressure coming back at you, just to ensure that that's not a variable that could be changing on you. When you're doing a really slow pre-infusion, arguably you could do a lesser pressure tamp, but there's not really any studies on that. There's just speculation online, and if it tastes good for you, okay, do it. It's always about what tastes best for you, because that's the one who's enjoying your espresso, not me, not the science, not the numbers, not these scientists. Doesn't really matter what's best for you, just hopefully this helps. But anyway, I hope that you appreciated the work put into this video. Thanks again to those who have run all these experiments before. Thanks to Hui for helping me run this experiment. Thank you for watching and for supporting the channel, and I truly hope that this helps you approach your espresso workflow. Thank you very much. Check out my Patreon below if you're interested in supporting. I have a second YouTube channel if you want to go check that out. But anyway, all of that being said, I hope that you brew something tasty today, and cheers.